So I'm delighted to be here. I have to warn you, my wife and I are here, and I took the train down from Massachusetts, and we have to go back to pick up our daughter, so I'm going to be slipping out before the end of the talk. What you're doing here is incredibly important, and I'm going to just run through some links between what's happening at Brown and the moment in history that you're in right now, and some other critical moments in history. I'm going to talk actually a little bit about the civil rights movement and about the South African divestment movement. And I decided just to make it a little more interesting that I'm going to do it as a countdown of the top 10 lessons, so that hopefully this will build some anticipation for what the ones at the top of the list are. But one of the things that is key is that divestment is a critical piece of a total set of problems that we're dealing with, that your generation is being asked to deal with. And so you have a very special role in history right now. You may not have expected that, you may not even want that, but the truth is that really the country is looking to you for leadership. So the number 10 strategy or point I want to make is that divestment is a tactic in the pursuit of a larger objective. So let's put this in context. We are talking about a country and a world that is pursuing a course of action, or really a course of inaction, that is on track to destroy the planet. Now, I have to say, when I was your age, we talked about a similar problem around nuclear weapons, but even that does not have the tremendous power that this problem does. And so the truth of the matter is that if this were a normal world, the leaders of our country would be acting to prevent this problem. They would be taking serious steps. That is not happening. In fact, they're resisting it. And by leaders, I don't just mean the people in Congress, I mean leaders across the board, people in my generation, who are putting off doing anything about this. And that includes the administrations of many universities, and we'll have to see what happens at Brown. But so far, Brown is still teeter-tottering on the edge of taking leadership or not. This is really an embarrassing failure on the part of my generation. And another reason why it's so critical for you to be engaged with this. And as I suggested, this is part of a cluster of difficult problems. The failure of economic models to really take into account what's happening in the country and in the world. The reality of broken democracy, as I was just saying, because people aren't addressing things. The growing problem of inequality, and the problem of ongoing growth. These are all tied together, and climate has emerged as one of the most urgent consequences of these other failures. Number 9, divestment as a tactic tends to upset your allies more than your opponents. And that's always been true. Climate deniers don't really care what you do. But people who say they are concerned about climate find themselves in a very awkward position when you ask them to think about their investments. And what's really interesting about this is I urge you to go back and read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. That letter is not directed at the racists of Birmingham, Alabama. That letter is directed at the moderate leaders who said that his intervention and his call for racial justice and his willingness to have demonstrations and direct action was, quote, unwise and untimely. And he goes on to say, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the great stumbling block to racial justice is the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods. Does that sound familiar? All right.
We snapped it.
All right. We snapped it. I agree with your goals, but I disagree with your tactics. That was true in civil rights, that was true in the South African divestment movement, and that is true again now. And you cannot let that dissuade you, although it can be troubling sometimes to hear that from people that you admire and that you like and who support that you want. But the truth is, it is unsettling. Number 8, divestment forces an examination between core values. The core values that drive an institution or that drive a person, and the moral purpose or financial gain that people have to choose from. Now, I won't go into this in great depth, but I just want to mention to you very quickly that organizations, when they think about what to do about almost anything, they worry about 5 things. And I'm just going to mention it to you so that you have this framework in your mind. They tend to worry about, number 1, survival. If I do this, is this going to kill us off? And then university, that means, are we still going to be here in 100 years for the students that are coming, for your successors? They worry about growth. We need to grow. That's a basic, I would say, idolatrous quality in our economy right now, that everything needs to grow all the time. And institutions are no different. They say we need more of everything. We need more money, we need more students, we need more knowledge, and we need to have more investments. And they worry about efficiency, which is whether they're wasting money or not. So those 3 things you can run up against when people talk about divestment. And that came up in South Africa, and it comes up now, and it'll come up anytime you raise that. But there are 2 other things they think about. They think about, does this action fit with our purpose as an institution? Does it fit with our mission? That would be called legitimacy. And they also worry about precedent or consistency. Has any other school ever done anything like this, or have we ever done anything like this in the past? And that's why what you're doing is so important, because not only are you making reference to things that Brown has done in the past and asking them to take a new step, but you're also laying down an example that when Brown divests, other schools and other students will seize on. And that's actually something that can make Brown leaders uncomfortable, but it's a critical thing. So divestment, as I just repeat, forces this examination and sets these different discussions, these different imperatives off against each other. Number 7, divestment is an effective strategy. People always tell us, it won't do anything. I gotta get used to this. It's like crickets. Very happy crickets. Now I want to give you some historical news. The South African divestment movement came in waves. And I think that we've already seen the climate movement has come in waves. And you have to be prepared for this. There's an intensification period, and then sometimes, like over the summer, or sometimes there's a relaxation, and then there's an intensification again. The divestment movement on climate started partly because there was no conversation about climate from our presidential candidates, which was bad enough. But even worse, there were no questions from any member of the press to any candidate ever on climate change. That is incredible. What happened? 350, Bill McKibben, the divestment movement started to form, and then we had Superstorm Sandy. And suddenly, that was a big moment when people began to ask questions. So the confluence of action and events began to come together. I just want to mention 2 very quick stories from the South African divestment movement. One is that there was tremendous pressure on the controller of the state of New York, who was the sole trustee of about $30 billion. His name was Ned Reagan. He was a Republican. People demanded that he sell off his South African stock. And he eventually said, I'm not going to do that, but what I am going to do is show up at the annual meetings of every major company and demand that they leave South Africa. Now, it was very uncomfortable for the CEOs of major companies to have the Republican treasurer of the state of New York show up to make that question. So Ned Reagan would never have taken that step, and he was only one participant if he hadn't been under pressure for a divestment. And many of the CEOs listened to him in a way they did not listen to others. The other is that, I'm summarizing a huge amount of history here, but because of the divestment movement that unfolded in the 70s and then again peaked in the 80s, the United States Congress which had officially opposed withdrawing or putting any pressure on companies in South Africa, reversed itself. And they passed a bill called the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in 1986. And they sent it to the White House, where it was vetoed by President Reagan. And it was sent back to Congress, where the veto override was led by Republican Senator Richard Lugar. And they succeeded in overriding President Reagan's veto. The only override in the history of, on a foreign policy question in the history of Reagan's presidency. Now, so imagine when sometimes we look at Congress and think they're never going to do anything. That was just as true in the late 70s, early 80s. And then by 1986, the Republicans were leading the charge against their own president. An amazing reality. Okay, number 6. This is very important for you to understand. Number 6, divestment is a routine part of managing funds. Now, there are two kinds of funds. And I'm summarizing, simplifying here a bit, but there are indexed funds where you basically buy a little piece of everything in the American economy. Or an actively managed fund, where you pick and choose how you want to balance your portfolio. Now, some people just index their money and watch the American economy go up or down. Most people have managed accounts. And what a manager does is that he or she pulls money in and out of different industries every day. So let me tell you something, and you're going to hear a letter from Tom Steyer, who did a $20 billion hedge fund. Any investment manager who says, I don't know how to rebalance a portfolio over 5 years is incompetent and should be fired. When they say to you, we can't do this, what they mean is we don't want to do this. And it's very important that you keep that in mind. And I'll tell you the simplest solution. It's actually a 3-letter solution. If somebody says we can't do this, some firm says, the solution is an RFP, a request for proposals. And all a school or an institution needs to do is say, okay, we understand, and put out a request that says, we have $300 million, we have $500 million, we have $800 million. We're looking for somebody to manage it without coal, without fossil fuel. Is there anybody out there who will do that? I tell you, 2 things will happen. The group that you are thinking of abandoning will change their mind, and other people will flock to manage the money. RFP. So don't listen to these arguments that it's totally impossible. That's just crazy. Number 5. So fossil fuel stocks, coal stocks are even worse than South African stocks were. South Africa were big blue chip companies that had a small portion of their operations. And even though they were making a lot of money, it was a distant place, and it didn't affect what was going on that much in the big company. Whereas if you look at coal companies, if you look at fossil fuel companies, they have, as Bill McKibben and others have pointed out, a business model that is committed to destroying the planet. And those of you, I'm sure many of you have seen, there are 5 times more reserves in the ground than we can afford to burn without destroying the planet. That is a bad business model. And as Tom Steyer in his letter says, good investors look forward. The bank, HSBC in England, said these companies could lose as much as 60% of their value if the governments step in and say, we're not going to let you buy all that. And let me just do some very quick numbers for you. If Brown has about $2.4 billion in its endowment, and it has, let's say, 2.2% in coal, that means it has about $48 million in coal. I don't know, I made these numbers up. I mean, the 2.4 billion is correct, but I'm guessing. And that means of that 48 million, if they get a 5% return, they're making about $2 million, $2.4 million a year. Now, if they got out of coal and into something else, that's not like they're going to pile it in the middle of campus and burn it. It means they're going to reinvest it in something that will earn just as much, or a little more, or a little less. The difference could be as little as $100,000, more or less. And one of the questions that the trustees and the president of Brown have to ask, are we willing to back this horrible investment and basically sell our souls for a variation of less than $100,000 a year? The other thing about it is that there are wonderful opportunities to take that money. Imagine if that $20 million were put in energy efficiency on campus here. Now, Brown is already doing some good things. I looked into this. Brown is putting money into energy efficiency, but they do not have a revolving loan fund which views this as an alternative investment. And investment in energy efficiency can get returns of 10, 15, 20, 25% with very fast paybacks. So you can make, if making money is part of your concern, you can make more money on energy efficiency than you can investing in coal. And that's something that needs to be brought up. Okay, number 4, engagement with divestment will change you. And that's a good thing, because it will ask you to really think about how the institutions you're engaged with really work, how the American economy really works. And as Christy mentioned before, it changed me. I got to Princeton, I went around, I was learning all these things in my classes, and then I heard this discussion about investment in South Africa, and the students who were teaching about that seemed to know more about the way the world ran than my professors. And I learned from them and decided these were fascinating questions that once they enter your mind are very hard to exclude. And so it's a good thing. This will change you. Now, to go back to Martin Luther King, he talked about 4 steps in working with or moving something forward. He talked about research, finding out what the truth was, negotiation, purification, which means when negotiation fails, you have to really ask yourself who you are and what you believe in, and then direct action. And direct action should take different forms. In the Civil Rights Movement, it took different forms. But those are the steps. You start with learning as much as you can. You begin the negotiation. If the negotiation doesn't go well, you go deep inside and ask yourself what you really stand for, what you believe in, and then you continue to act. And I just want to mention, just read it again briefly from the letter from the Birmingham jail. He says, "You are quite right in calling for negotiation. This is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create a crisis and foster a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is then forced to confront an issue. It seeks to dramatize an issue that can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of resistance may sound rather shocking, but I am not afraid of the word tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open, where it can be seen and dealt with." And I think there are a huge number of parallels to what's going on right now. Number 3, engagement with the divestment question unlocks these much more basic questions about the economy. And I just want to speak briefly about the New Economics Institute. We put out an RFP back in December in the middle of exam week, not the smartest thing you'd ever think of doing, asking students if they would like to receive a $5,000 grant to hold summits on the new economy. We had enough money for 8 $5,000 grants. We heard in exam week from 72 colleges and universities wanting to hold the deeper discussion about the future of the American economy. 72. And we got 45 wonderful applications, of which we eventually funded 14. And those are happening right now all around the country. We also are well aware that there are 250 campuses now talking about divestment. Students are asking these fundamental questions. What is the relationship between these core structural aspects of the economy? And we're hoping that this will continue to grow, and that next year we will hand out more money, there will be more discussions, more economics departments wondering whether they're actually teaching the things that students want to learn, more discussion about the need for real systemic change. So engagement with the divestment question unlocks these fundamental things. Number 2, divestment is a concrete action which your institution can take and which you can support and act for in a sea of shameful and suicidal apathy. That was true in the South African question when people were being killed by the South African military that were occupying the townships, and there was apathy. until a group of young people rose up and said, we understand, we can see what is happening, and we are going to step forward and offer leadership. It is even more intensely needed now, if that's possible. So, as I said at the beginning, you know, I've been working on climate for more than 20 years. I regret that there isn't more to show for it. We now need to enlist some new energy and new force and new passion. I haven't lost my passion, but I'm starting to lose a little bit of my energy. So I could use, and all those who have been working on this and care about this, need you to step up to the leadership, which is naturally yours. And then number one, the number one thing that I'd like you to remember is that divestment is an action which showed in the South African movement where that individual and institutional action could change the course of history. People say over and over and over again, it's ineffective, it won't work. But it did work. It worked because people were saying, I don't know if it's exactly what's going to happen, but I know what I believe in, and I know what I'm going to do. And I know what I'm going to ask other people to do. And I don't care if I can't draw a direct line between this and the exact solution. I am going to act because that's what I believe in. And I'm going to read to you, in closing, I'm going to read to you a quote by an incredible man named Albie Sachs. Albie Sachs was a white lawyer from Cape Town. He joined the African National Congress because he believed in non-racial democracy. When apartheid intensified under the National Party, he had to flee the country because he knew he would be imprisoned for the rest of his life. He went to Mozambique. The South African secret police tracked him down, and they wired his car with a bomb. And when he opened the door, the bomb went off, and it blew off his right arm, and it blinded him in one eye. It took him a long time to recover. But when there were democratic elections, he was invited to return to South Africa. And he was made the equivalent of a Supreme Court justice in South Africa, what they call the Constitutional Court. And he wrote a beautiful book where he talked about his reflection on this incredible journey from passion to oppression to victory. And this is the quote I want to end with. Did things just happen, or did we make things come about? I knew that nothing we were living through had just come to pass. We had willed it all, worked for it, never given up, never let go of the basic ideas. Yes, we had believed, belief had been fundamental, but we had backed that belief up with endless hard work. And we learned how to do things together, and to accommodate the fears and the interests of others, and to survive the sarcasm and disbelief of those who regarded themselves as more knowledgeable about what they called the real world. And we just kept going, on and on, until at last the impossible became feasible, then real, and finally inevitable. That's what we're asking you to do. To make it feasible, and then real, and then inevitable. That's your role in history, and I know you will embrace it. Thank you. I just want to tell you, it is incredible that I came in at 20 minutes. And so I'm delighted that I packed all that in. I'm now happy to take any questions before you move on to the next rest of the program, about any aspect of what was it. Yeah.
What do you think a good response would be for us? We deal with a lot of questions about, well, even if Brown or all the, higher institutions of learning in the U.S. divest from the fossil fuel industry, there's still, countries like China and India who are going to be depending so heavily that this even symbolically, what differences it really make?
So the question was, what difference does it make? Because even if everybody divested in the U.S., there's still lots of other countries. it sounds like a very appealing and persuasive question that's being raised by the doubters. But the truth of the matter is that if you really asked about effectiveness, why should anyone ever vote, for example? I mean, it's just one vote. What difference does it make? And you have to believe in the cumulative power of action. Now, there's this idea that the United States is automatically the leader, and even if we lead, nobody else will follow. The reality is that most of the rest of the countries are leading, and we are behind. And people would, and yet we are one of the major sources of CO2 in the world. And if we were to act, people would applaud. And just to take China, for example, China, yes, is building coal power plants like crazy, but they are also the leading producer of solar cells right now. They're also experimenting with cap and trade. They are also doing planning for a long-term future that does not depend on fossil fuel. And China, it is a very closed system. My son just got back from 2 years of working there for a Chinese company. There are a lot of things you cannot do in China that we take for granted here. But one thing that can happen in China is when they move, things start to happen. And when they wanted to shut down coal plants around Beijing for the Beijing Olympics, they shut down. So it is a tempting thing to say, well, we're not going to have any effect. But in a sense, our entire purpose as human beings is to counter that argument. Otherwise, there'd be no purpose to do anything that mattered other than to seize the most for yourself. So it's a real question that's brought up all the time, but it's a dangerous and seductive question that is actually very damaging to the core idea of individual participation and public participation. I'm sorry. Yeah.
So I think the fact that this movement, the movement that you were involved in, were both led by students, I think is significant. Both because students have a lot of energy, but also because students, there is some degree of paternalism when we're talking to administrators. You know, they can carry the card where they're like, you know, you don't know as much as us, or like you're not in touch with like reality. We run the endowment, etc., etc. During your movement, how did you like imbue students not only with energy but with legitimacy?
It's a really good question. The question was, in the face of paternalism from administrations, how do you imbue students with the energy to stand up and challenge this? It's a gradual process. I believe that there's a kind of a cycle that as we become aware of things, this is not just true of climate, but of almost everything, as we become aware of things, our beliefs start to migrate and change. And as our beliefs change, our actions start to change. And then as our actions change, our awareness changes again. And you can get on that cycle anywhere. You can start by being involved in something and then realize, oh my gosh, I didn't realize what this was all about, and learning. That's actually what happened to me. There were students marching around in front of Nassau Hall at Princeton, and I was involved in other political activity, and I started marching around with them because I kind of agreed with them. And then I discovered in greater and greater depth what they were talking about, and I was able to provide some leadership and some support. So I would say you have to work on all three. You have to work on the awareness question, kind of what Dr. King was talking about in terms of the research and these kind of events. Then you have to ask people what they really believe in, and then you have to move to action. We marched around Nassau Hall every single day, rain or shine, and we had some great chants. And in fact, one of the things that, you know, I can pass on to you are some chant. Actually, I'll do one right now. Are you ready? Okay, ready? I don't know how, it required two, it was Princeton divest. Okay. Brown divest, just like the rest. And if you don't, we will not rest. We're gonna fight and keep on fighting some more. Princeton divest, that's what it was. Just like the rest. And if you don't, we will not rest. We're gonna fight, and keep on fighting some more. Now you get a drum in that. You get 100 or 200 people keeping warm by going around like this. The administration cannot forget that you're out there the whole day, or whatever time you do. And the thing I want to tell you, which you have to decide in your own time and place, depending on the reaction you get, hopefully Brown will see the light and become a national leader. If you don't, as Princeton did not, 200 of us seized and occupied the administration hall. That happened all across the country. You're going to have to think about that. And even if Brown divests, you're going to have to think about how you can support students at other schools that won't. This is a real battle. This isn't an artificial battle. This is a real battle. It's just as real. It's different, but it's just as real as what Dr. King faced. It is just as real as the South African debate, and it has just as much at stake in a different way. And again, it's not an abstract thing. It is a place where each of you has both the opportunity and obligation to think through how you're going to respond. Let them patronize you. You are right. They have blown it. And they don't really want to deal with that. And that's why they want to blow you off. I was actually more radical when I was younger, so I've toned down quite a bit. So I'll just maybe take one more and let you go on with your program. If there is. Yes, sir.
Not a student, so I apologize. But I'm trying to spread the divestment movement to the state.
Yeah.
And they've come back with, and I think this is going to happen across the country, as people ask states and municipalities to divest in coal and fossil fuel. They've said they have a fiduciary responsibility to meet the particular returns on their pension fund investments. And I don't know where you can go to fight that.
Yeah. So the question is, or maybe you all heard it, about fiduciary responsibility. There's two things wrong with that. One is there is absolutely no fiduciary responsibility to make a bad investment. It may have been good in the past, but it is a crappy one today. So part of it is to challenge the underlying assumption that this is a great investment that they're going to give up. Say, no, go back to the HSBC study, go back. So if you take fiduciary duty, this obligation to earn the maximum amount, it does not apply to making stupid investments. The second thing to say is that legally, people use this all the time, but it's actually a misreading of the law. Fiduciary responsibility means that you must do what you believe is in the long-term best interest of your beneficiaries. Now let me just ask you, imagine somebody using this argument around slavery, which is particularly relevant to Brown. I'm sorry, it's our fiduciary responsibility, so we have to maximize our investment in slaveholding companies to get the best returns so that students can come to this school. That, in fact, was part of the problem at the formation of Brown. And Brown has come a long way in examining that history and in dealing with it. This is the slavery issue of our era. And so the fiduciary question does not obligate you to make the most money. It obligates you to fulfill the best interest of your beneficiaries as defined by you. And just to add one thing to give you a little confidence, that is overseen by the courts under something called the business judgment rule. And the business judgment rule says a group of trustees making an honest decision about what they think is the best interest of their institution cannot be overruled. Otherwise, courts would get involved with trying to manage everybody's business all the time. So the business judgment rule says if the trustees of Brown say to benefit their beneficiaries over the long term, they do not want to be involved in this, no one can touch them. And excuse me, in terms of the state, it's basically the same thing. It is the same thing. Fiduciary duty does not mean earn the most money no matter what. And it's often used as that excuse. That's false. And if you need some evidence of that, there's a 750-page book I can point you to that I wrote 15 years ago that will be happy to take up your time and build your arm strength as you read it. Anyway, listen, I really admire what you're doing. My wife teaches at the Rhode Island School of Design, Ann Tate, right up here. Anna's a great leader in this movement too. And I'm happy to keep going, keep coming back, do whatever you need. So I admire you, and I want you to just stay with it.
Thank you so much. Who learned something new?